But it does mean that the military tactics that we use are going to have to evolve. Instead of having a very small number of very high-end military vehicles, you just launch a cloud of very low-end stuff that is attritable and disposable. I don't think people have thought through how much that gives the advantage to a country like the United States. We will have to fight differently, and kind of the sunk costs that we've put into some of these technologies are suddenly going to become very questionable. But there is no country in the world that can adapt in the way the United States can. So let's say 2 years from now, we have a direct fight between the Americans and the Chinese. Sure, they can build a lot of drones, but they have to target something that they can't see and that can move. And AI is nowhere close to being able to target things over the horizon where they have to do a search pattern. Whereas the US Navy is going to know exactly where their targets are. They're on land with satellite recon, we can find them. And we just launched 10,000 drones at whatever it happens to be. So this is a really, really bad development for the Russias and the Chinas and the Irans of the world, getting the Americans to think about this differently. Because our ability to adapt to that environment, combined with our mobile firepower of the Navy, that's going to be crippling for all of them. There's a lot to unpack in that. Let's start with the things I am not worried about. Most of the stuff we sent to Ukraine is hand-me-downs that we haven't used in over 25 years. And honestly, the Russians are doing a favor because we're disposing of it into their teeth. Otherwise, we would have to dispose of it ourselves, which would cost money. So actually, the Russians are doing a financial solid by absorbing that ammo for us. Israel's a little bit different. Israel is a much more technologically acute force, and they're after things that are precision guided, and that they have to get from the United States. So the financial cost of supporting Ukraine is very, very low in real terms. The financial support of Israel is much, much, much higher. That said, this is a country of only 8 million people, and they're trying to carry out a military operation in a zone that's only twice the size of the District of Columbia. So the scale of the needs is relatively low in comparison to what the US military is capable of. For the broader question, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the United States when it comes to making budgetary savings. We have a healthcare system that is by far the most expensive in the world, twice that of your average first world country. And if we're able to just kind of go to a middle of the road system, we'd save 10% of GDP right off the top, which would pay for everything we're discussing here, in addition to entitlement reform. Would pay for it all, just that one thing. I would love to see meaningful healthcare reform in this country. Barring that, as long as the United States is the sole currency, and again, there's no pretender to the throne at the moment, we do have the option of monetizing. That is not my preference, but it seems to be the preference for the last 5 political administrations. And honestly, if Americans had a problem with that and wanted to have a different system, they would have voted for the other guy every single time. There's an opportunity cost here. If we had stuck with what Bill Clinton did with the balancing of the budget back in the 90s, not only would we not have a budget deficit today, but we would have paid for the retirement of the baby boomers. But we chose a different road. So there's a difference between the opportunity cost and a national cost. There's no alternative for anyone right now. And honestly, the more the US withdraws from the world economically, the more viable the US dollar becomes as the global currency. Because the first thing you want from a currency is for whoever controls it to not intervene in currency markets to benefit themselves. So I feel bad about this. I'm a fiscal conservative, but people who feel my way have been out of power now. Well, supporters obviously believe in him. No shock there. Okay, so a couple things. Number one, he has full control over the Republican Party apparatus, and I have no doubt that he'll get the nomination. I mean, he could campaign from prison where he's been convicted of 90 felonies, which is how many there are now. And he could live stream the abortion of his underage illegal migrant trans lover, and he would still get the nomination. He's got a lock on that. His supporters are fervent. They're cultists. They're not going anywhere. But then he has to win the general. And if there is one thing that Donald Trump has made very clear, it's that he doesn't think that the decision should be made by the general population in the general election. He wants the competition to be purely at the primary level. And so if you're an American independent, you're like, hold my beer. Because independents in the last midterms did three things that hadn't happened in American history before. One, they showed up. Independents usually don't vote in the midterms at all. Second, independents will violently vote for their own perceived best interests. And in exit polling, they indicated they thought the Biden administration was doing a horrible job and that his economic policy was borderline suicidal, and that the damage being done to independents in particular were unfair and unwise. And they voted for Democrats anyway. And then third, independents almost never vote for the same side twice. They're very fickle. And so when Trump lost, they were voting against him. And then they voted against him again. And so if the independents are willing to break all these normal patterns, you've got to look at the electoral map of the United States and figure out which states the independents hold the swing. And that's about 20 of them. And so you take the states that will go red no matter what happens with the independents, and the ones that will go blue without whatever happens to the independents, you put them to the side and you look at what's left, they all go purple. So we're probably looking at the Trump team getting maybe a dozen states, none of which are big. And with Biden sweeping, among other places, Texas and Florida. Oh yeah, no, this all assumes that neither of them die. That's fair. If one of them keels over for whatever reason, then we're in a completely different environment. Right. Yeah. Which incidentally is another great entry point for a potential third party. Well, let's hit it from the non-political demographic angle first before we get into the muck. The United States birth rate is the lowest in its history. And if we continue on our current path, we're going to be facing a Chinese or European style dissolution 30, 40, well, no, 50, 60 years from now. So we're at the beginning of what could be a very dangerous period. And in the next 15 years, we're going to see China and Germany disassociate. And so we're going to get some very clear examples of the path that we're on soon. China will cease to be a functional nation state with an industrial economy.
Because of the birth rate.
Yeah, their birth rate dropped by 70% in just the last 5 years. We have a number of countries in the world that are in a similar situation. Korea, Germany, Italy, and to a lesser degree, Spain are all in that same bucket. But it's not that they're running out of children. For most of them, that happened 30 years ago. This is the decade they run out of working aged adults. So young people do the consumption. How do you run a system without consumption? Older workers do the production investment. How do you run a system without production and investment? So at a minimum, we're looking at a fundamentally new economic model that hasn't been invented yet. And for a system like China, where decision-making is now impossible, I'm looking at them losing national cohesion.
What does that look like?
This has happened 20-odd times in Chinese history, so there's a really rich palette of national disasters to draw from. All of them involve a degree of civil breakdown, warlordism, and famine. People forget that what sets the China of today out from the China of the last 3,000 years is the Americans provided them with trade access to the world for the first time and sent all the regional powers that were occupying home for the first time. And so for the last couple generations, the Chinese have been allowed to build without interruption while having American granted access to the world. This is not their normal.